I stood in the ancient church in Boston, the stained glass windows casting fractured beams of red, blue, and gold across my pristine white wedding gown. The air smelled of polished wood and old hymnals, and the soft hum of the organ filled the space, a haunting melody that felt more like a dirge than a celebration. Today, I, Margaret Sullivan, Maggie to those who knew me best, was marrying Ethan Caldwell, the CEO of Caldwell Industries. A man I'd met only 3 times before this moment. A man whose cold, unyielding gaze I could feel even now, as he stood beside me at the altar, his presence as distant as the stars outside. This wasn't a marriage born of love. It was a contract, a transaction as sterile as the papers I'd signed 2 weeks ago in a glass-walled office downtown. Ethan needed a wife to appease his board of directors, to prove he was a stable family man capable of leading a billion-dollar empire. I needed the money to save my mother, Evelyn, from the heart condition that was stealing her breath a little more each day, and to keep our family home, the only place I'd ever felt truly safe, from being foreclosed. But as the priest's voice echoed through the church, asking if I took this man to be my husband, my throat tightened. "I do," I whispered, the words barely audible, as if I could will them to mean less than they did. I glanced at Ethan, hoping for a flicker of warmth, a sign that this might one day be more than a deal. But his jaw was set, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the priest, as if I were nothing more than a formality. He slipped the ring onto my finger, his touch as cold as the platinum band itself. The church was filled with the elite of Boston, men, in tailored suits, women in glittering gowns, but the air felt hollow, the applause perfunctory. I was a stranger in my own wedding, a pawn in a game I hadn't chosen to play. Before I'd walked down the aisle, I'd paused at the entrance of the church, my mother beside me in her wheelchair. Her frail hands trembled as I adjusted the silk, scarf around her shoulders, the soft fabric slipping through my fingers like the years we'd lost to hardship. "You don't have to do this for me, Maggie," she'd whispered, her voice fragile but fierce. The same voice that had carried us through the darkest days after my father's death in a car accident when I was 10. I'd smiled, though my eyes burned with unshed tears. "I'm doing this because I love you, Mom," I'd said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. But as I stood at the altar now, I wondered if love was enough to justify the weight of this moment. My mind drifted to the sacrifices that had brought me here. I'd once dreamed of being a teacher, of shaping young minds with stories and kindness, but those dreams had crumbled under the reality of our finances. After Dad died, Mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, her hands calloused from cleaning, offices at night and serving coffee during the day. I'd taken a job in accounting instead, the steady paycheck a lifeline for us, but it had never filled the hollow space where my dreams used to live. Now, standing here in this church, I felt that hollow space grow wider, a chasm I wasn't sure I could ever bridge. As the ceremony ended, I caught a snippet of conversation from 2 guests in the pews behind me. "Ethan Caldwell had a child once, didn't he?" one whispered, her voice low but sharp. "No one knows what happened to her," the other replied. I turned my head slightly, my heart stuttering at the words. A child? Ethan had never mentioned a child. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to gossip. But a seed of unease took root in my chest, its tendrils curling around my already fragile resolve. Ethan and I stepped out of the church into the crisp Boston air, the sky a muted gray that mirrored the heaviness in my heart. He offered me his arm, a gesture more for the cameras than for me, and I took it, my fingers barely brushing the sleeve of his tailored suit. "We don't have to pretend to love each other, Margaret," he said, his voice low and clipped, as if he were dictating terms in a boardroom. "This is just a deal." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to steady. "I know," I replied, "but I can't pretend this doesn't hurt." I looked back at the church doors, where my mother sat, her wheelchair positioned, just inside the threshold. Her eyes met mine, a mix of pride and worry shimmering in their depths, and I felt a pang of guilt for the burden I'd placed on her heart. I was doing this for her, for the surgeries she needed, for the home where we'd built a lifetime of memories. But at what cost? I turned away, my gaze settling on the horizon, where the city lights flickered like distant promises I wasn't sure I could keep. As we walked toward the waiting car, I made a silent vow to myself. I would survive this marriage for my mother's sake, but I wouldn't let it break me. I couldn't. Because if I did, I'd lose the only thing I had left. The hope that one day I might find a way to be whole again. As we walked toward the waiting car, I made a silent vow to myself. I would survive this marriage for my mother's sake, but I wouldn't let it break me. I couldn't. Because if I did, I'd lose the only thing I had left. The hope that one day I might find a way to be whole again. The drive to Ethan's mansion in the outskirts of Boston was as silent as the ceremony had been. I sat in the back seat of the sleek black car, my hands folded tightly in my lap, the weight of the platinum wedding band on my finger feeling heavier with every mile. Ethan sat beside me, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the tablet and his hands scrolling through what I assumed were business reports. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by the shadowy outlines of trees and the occasional glow of a street lamp. I wanted to speak, to break the suffocating quiet, but the words wouldn't come. What do you say to a man who's now your husband but feels like a stranger? The mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling estate of stone and glass, its windows glowing, with a warm amber light that promised a comfort I knew I wouldn't find inside. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out, the hem of my wedding gown brushing against the gravel driveway. Ethan didn't offer his hand this time. No cameras to perform for now, and I followed him up the steps, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and resignation. This was my new home, but it felt more like a gilded cage. Inside, the mansion was as grand as I'd expected, with marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with modern art that probably cost more than my mother's house. A housekeeper greeted us with a polite nod, her eyes flickering with curiosity before she disappeared down a hallway. Ethan led me to the master bedroom, a cavernous space with a king-sized bed draped in white linens, a fireplace that crackled softly, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the darkened garden below. The beauty of the room was undeniable, but it did nothing to ease the chill in my bones. "I'll be working late," Ethan said, his voice as cold as the marble beneath my feet. He didn't look at me as he spoke, already moving toward a leather armchair in the corner, where he set his tablet down and opened a laptop. "You can do whatever you want." The dismissal stung, though I wasn't sure why I'd expected anything more. I nodded, though he wasn't watching, and turned toward the ensuite bathroom to change out of my gown. As I slipped out of the heavy satin and into a simple silk nightgown, my mind drifted to a memory that felt like a lifetime ago. It was a winter evening, the kind where the air bit at your cheeks and the snow crunched underfoot. I was 9, sitting with my mother by the fireplace in our old house, the one we were now fighting to keep. The flames had danced in the hearth, casting a golden glow over her face as she told me stories about my father. How he'd always put family first. How he'd once spent his last dollar on a bouquet of daisies just to make her smile. "Family is everything, Maggie," she'd said, her voice soft but firm. I'd believed her then. But now, standing in this sterile room, I wondered if I'd ever feel that warmth again. I stepped back into the bedroom, my bare feet silent on the plush rug. Ethan hadn't moved, his focus still on his laptop, the blue, light casting harsh shadows across his face. I wanted to ask him about his family, to find some crack in the wall he'd built around himself, but I hesitated. Still, the silence was unbearable, so I forced the words out. "Do you ever think we could be a real family?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. Ethan's fingers paused on the keyboard, and for a moment, I thought he might ignore me. But then he looked up, his gray eyes as unreadable as ever. "Family is something I gave up on a long time ago, Margaret," he said, his tone flat, final. "Don't hope for something that can't happen." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I turned away, my chest tight with a grief I couldn't name. I crossed the room to the window, pressing my hand against the cool glass as I stared out at the garden below. The darkness outside mirrored the emptiness inside me, and I felt the tears I'd been holding back all day spill over. I thought of my mother again, of the way her voice had sounded when I'd called her earlier that evening, just before we left the church. "How are you feeling, Mom?" I'd asked, trying to keep my tone light. But I'd heard the strain in her breathing, the faint cough that punctuated her words as she assured me she was fine. "I'll come see you soon," I'd promised. But the guilt gnawed at me. I should have been with her tonight, not here, playing the role of a wife to a man who didn't even see me. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as I wiped the tears from my cheeks. Ethan's words echoed in my mind, "Don't hope for something that can't happen," but I couldn't let them define me. I thought of my mother's strength, the way she'd carried us through years of hardship with nothing but love and determination. If she could endure so much, then I could endure this. I had to. For her, I glanced at Ethan one last time, his silhouette a stark contrast against the glow of his laptop screen. He was a fortress, impenetrable and cold. But I wouldn't let him break me. I'd made a vow today, not just to him, but to myself. I would survive this marriage, and I would find a way to keep my mother safe, no matter what it took. The weeks following the wedding blurred into a haze of glittering events and hollow smiles. As the new Mrs. Caldwell, I was thrust into a world I'd only ever glimpsed from the outside, a world of charity galas, private dinners, and cocktail parties, where every word was a performance, every glance a judgment. Tonight, I stood in a ballroom at the Four Seasons in Boston, the chandeliers above casting a golden glow over the crowd of Boston's elite. My navy blue gown hugged my frame, its elegance a stark contrast to the unease churning in my stomach. Ethan stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my lower back, but the gesture felt more like a prop than a comfort. We were a picture-perfect couple for the cameras, but the space between us was as cold as the champagne in my hand. I could feel the eyes on me, the whispers trailing in my wake like a shadow I couldn't shake. "She's just a gold digger," a woman in a sequined dress murmured to her companion, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. "Married him for the money, no doubt." I tightened my grip on the glass, my knuckles whitening as I forced a smile. I wanted to turn around, to tell her that I'd give anything to be anywhere but here, that I was doing this for my mother, not for wealth. But I couldn't. I had to play the part for Ethan's sake, for the deal we'd made, for the hospital bills that were piling up faster than I could count. Ethan, as always, seemed oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His focus was on the men in suits across the room, the board members of Caldwell Industries who held his future in their hands. I'd learned quickly that our marriage wasn't just a formality, it was a test. The board had been pressuring Ethan to prove his stability, to show that he was more than a ruthless businessman, that he could be a family man worthy of leading their empire. But as I watched him exchange curt nods and clipped words with them, I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened with every handshake. He was under scrutiny, and I was the key to his redemption, or his downfall. I excused myself, needing a moment to breathe, and made my way to a quieter corner of the ballroom. But before I could reach the solace of a shadowed alcove, a man stepped into my path. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and eyes that glinted with something dangerous. "Margaret Caldwell, I presume," he said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. I nodded, my instincts prickling. I'm Richard Langston, he continued, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. An old acquaintance of your husband's. There was something in the way he said acquaintance that made my stomach twist. It's nice to meet you, I replied, though the words felt hollow. Richard's smile widened, but it was the kind of smile that made you want to step back. I'm sure Ethan hasn't told you about me, he said, his tone almost playful, or about his daughter for that matter. Did you know he abandoned her? Left her and her mother to fend for themselves while he built his empire? My breath caught in my throat, the words hitting me like a physical blow. A daughter? The whisper I'd overheard at the wedding flashed through my mind. Ethan Caldwell had a child once, and suddenly, it didn't feel like gossip anymore. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Ethan isn't the man you think he is, Margaret. He destroyed my company, drove me to bankruptcy with his cutthroat tactics, and he'll destroy you too, if you let him. His words were a poison, seeping into the cracks of my already fragile resolve. I wanted to argue, to defend Ethan, but the truth was, I didn't know him well enough to do either. I turned away, my heart pounding, and made my way back to Ethan's side. He was still deep in conversation with a board member, but I couldn't. Wait. Ethan, I said, my voice low but urgent. We need to talk. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, but he excused himself and followed me to a quieter corner of the room. What is it? He asked, his tone clipped, as if I were an inconvenience. Who's Richard Langston? I demanded, watching, his face for any sign of recognition. His jaw tightened, a flicker of something, anger, maybe fear, crossing his eyes before he masked it. No one you need to worry about, he said, but his voice was too controlled, too careful. And what about your daughter? I pressed, my voice trembling now. Richard said you abandoned her. Is that true? For a moment, I thought he might answer, but then his expression hardened, the wall between us rising higher than ever. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, his voice like a whip. Stay out of things that don't concern you. He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, my chest tight with a mix of anger and hurt. I watched him disappear into the crowd, his broad shoulders cutting through the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos. The whispers around me grew louder, the weight of their judgment pressing down on me like a physical force. I felt trapped, caught between the promise I'd made to my mother and the growing suspicion that I'd married a man who was hiding more than I could ever imagine. I wanted to run, to leave this world of secrets and lies behind, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth, and not until I'd done everything in my power to keep my mother safe. The encounter with Richard Langston at the gala left a bitter taste in my mouth, his words echoing in my mind like a relentless drumbeat. Ethan abandoned his daughter. I couldn't shake the image of a little girl, alone and forgotten, while her father built an empire on the ashes of her childhood. Ethan's refusal to answer my questions only deepened the unease that had taken root in my chest. I needed to know the truth, not just for myself, but for the fragile hope I still clung to, the hope that this marriage could be more than a transaction, that Ethan might be more than the cold, unfeeling man he presented to the world. It was late, well past midnight, when I found myself standing outside the door to Ethan's study in the mansion. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Ethan had gone to bed hours ago, his presence in the master bedroom as distant as ever. But I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of questions, and I knew I wouldn't find peace until I had answers. I turned the doorknob, the soft click sounding, louder in the stillness, and slipped inside. The study was a reflection of Ethan himself, impeccable, controlled, and cold. A mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface bare except for a sleek laptop and a single framed photo of a yacht I assumed he owned. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than read, and a large window overlooked the garden, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. I moved to the desk, my heart pounding as I opened the top drawer. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Something, anything, that might shed light on the man I'd married. The drawer held nothing but pens, a few business cards, and a stack of financial reports. I was about to close it when my fingers brushed against something at the back, a small, worn envelope tucked beneath the papers. I pulled it out, my breath catching as I saw the faded handwriting on the front. To Ethan, from Laura. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a photograph and a single sheet of paper. The photo was of Ethan, younger and softer somehow, his arm around a little girl with dark hair and eyes that mirrored his own, gray, deep, and haunted. On the back, in the same handwriting, were the words, Sophie, 2010. My heart stopped. Sophie. This was the daughter Richard had spoken of, the child Ethan had abandoned. I stared at her face, at the way her eyes seemed to hold a quiet sadness, and I felt a wave of grief for a girl I'd never met. I imagined her growing up without a father, wondering why he'd left. And the thought brought tears to my eyes. I knew that pain too well. My own father had been taken from me by a car accident when I was 10, and the void he'd left had never fully healed, but at least I'd had my mother, her love a constant anchor in the storm of my childhood. What had Sophie had? I unfolded the letter, my hands shaking as I read the words written in a hurried, anguished scrawl. Ethan, I can't do this anymore. You're never here. Not for me, not for Sophie. I'm taking her and leaving. Don't try to find us. Laura. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan hadn't just abandoned his daughter. He'd driven her mother away, too consumed by his ambition to see what he was losing. I clutched the letter to my chest, my tears falling onto the paper, blurring the ink. I thought of my own mother, of the years she'd spent working herself to the bone to keep us afloat, and I couldn't imagine her ever leaving me, no matter how hard things got. I sank into the chair behind the desk, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Part of me felt betrayed. Ethan had hidden this from me, a secret so profound it changed everything I thought I knew about him. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the warmth of my mother's love, ached for him. What had driven him to this? What kind of pain had he buried so deep that he'd let his own child slip away? I needed to confront him, to demand the truth, but I couldn't do it now. Not in the middle of the night. Not when my emotions were a tangled mess of anger and sorrow. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number, needing the sound of her voice to ground me. Maggie? She answered, her voice thick with sleep but laced with concern. What's wrong? I found something. Mom, I said, my voice breaking as I told her about the photo, the letter, the daughter Ethan had left behind. I expected her to be angry, to tell me to leave him, but instead, she sighed softly. People make mistakes, Maggie, she said, her tone gentle, but firm. What matters is whether they're willing to fix them. You need to decide if you can trust him to try. Her words stayed with me long after I hung up, echoing in the silence of the study. I looked at the photo again, at Sophie's sad eyes, and made a decision. I wouldn't let myself become someone who turned away from family, who let pain dictate her choices. I'd confront Ethan, but I'd do it with the hope that he could change, that he could be the man Sophie needed, the man I needed him to be. For my mother's sake, for Sophie's, and maybe, just maybe, for my own. The photograph of Sophie and the letter from Laura haunted me for days, their weight a constant pressure against my chest. I hadn't confronted Ethan yet. I couldn't find the words, not when my emotions were a tangled mess of betrayal and pity. But the fragile balance I'd been clinging to shattered one morning when I opened my laptop to check my email and saw the headline on the Boston Globe's website. CEO Caldwell, a sham marriage and a dark past. My heart plummeted as I clicked the link, the words blurring before my eyes. Richard Langston had made good on his threat. The article was a vicious exposé, claiming that my marriage to Ethan was a fraud, a calculated move to appease his board of directors. It went further, dredging up the story of Sophie, Ethan's abandoned daughter, painting him as a heartless father who'd chosen ambition over family. The comments section was even worse. "Margaret Sullivan is nothing but a gold digger," one user wrote. "Ethan Caldwell doesn't deserve to lead Caldwell Industries," another sneered. I scrolled through the vitriol, each word a dagger, until I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. I knew Richard was behind this. He'd all but promised to destroy Ethan at the gala, but the depth of his cruelty stunned me. The article wasn't just an attack on Ethan. It was an assault on me, on my dignity, on the sacrifices I'd made for my mother. I felt exposed, as if the entire world could see the cracks in my carefully constructed facade. And worse, I felt complicit. I'd known about Sophie, and I'd done nothing. Had my silence made me an accomplice to Ethan's past sins? I found Ethan in his study, his face pale as he stared at his phone, no doubt reading the same article. "Did you see this?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. He looked up, his gray eyes stormy, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his usually impenetrable armor. "Yes," he said, his voice low, controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. The stock is plummeting." Before I could respond, he stood, grabbing his coat. "We need to go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." We drove to Caldwell Industries headquarters. In silence, the tension between us a living thing, coiling tighter with every mile. The city lights blurred past the car windows, their glow a stark contrast to the darkness inside me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat, trapped by the weight of the moment. The boardroom was a battlefield. The directors sat around a polished mahogany table, their faces a mix of anger and disdain as they grilled Ethan about the article. "This is a disaster, Caldwell," one of them barked, a gray-haired man with a voice like gravel. "The shareholders are in a panic. If you can't prove this marriage is real, we'll have no choice but to replace you." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "My marriage is none of your concern," he said, his voice cold as ice. "I'll handle the press." I stood silently at his side, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, but inside, I was unraveling. The board's scrutiny, the public's judgment, it was all too much. And then, as if the universe hadn't dealt us enough, Richard Langston walked in, his presence a dark cloud in the already tense room. "I thought you might need a reminder of who you're dealing with, Ethan," he said, his voice dripping with malice. He turned to the board, a smirk playing on his lips. "Did you know I was the one who arranged this marriage? I hired the lawyer who drafted their contract. It was all a setup to expose Ethan for the fraud he is." The room erupted in murmurs, the board members exchanging shocked glances. I felt the blood drain from my face, my knees threatening to buckle. A setup? Richard had orchestrated our marriage, not just to humiliate Ethan, but to destroy him. And I'd been a pawn in his game, a willing participant in my own downfall. Ethan's hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, but he didn't speak. The The silence was deafening, a void that swallowed every ounce of hope I'd been clinging to. We left the meeting in a daze, the board's ultimatum ringing in my ears. Prove the marriage was real, or Ethan would lose everything. In the car, the tension between us finally snapped. "Did you know?" I demanded, my voice raw with emotion. "Did you know Richard was behind this?" Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't matter. I can't lose everything again, Margaret." "Again?" I shouted, my anger boiling over. "What about Sophie? What about the daughter you abandoned? You're losing her all over again, and you don't even care." Ethan slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop on the side of the road. He turned to me, his face a mask of fury and pain. "You don't understand," he roared. "I didn't want to lose her, but I did, and I've been paying for it every day since." I stared at him, my chest heaving, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, I saw the man beneath the facade, a man broken by his own choices, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. But before I could respond, my phone rang, the sound jarring in the charged silence. It was the hospital. "Mrs. Caldwell," the nurse said, her voice urgent. "Your mother's condition has worsened. You need to come now." I hung up, my heart in my throat, and looked at Ethan. "I don't need you," I said, my voice trembling with resolve. "But my mother does." He nodded, his expression unreadable, and started the car. As we drove toward the hospital, I knew I was standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong step, and everything I'd fought for would come crashing down. The hospital corridors were a blur of white walls and antiseptic scent as I rushed toward the ICU, my heart pounding in my chest. The nurse's words echoed in my mind. "Your mother's condition has worsened," each syllable a dagger twisting deeper into my already fragile resolve. I'd left Ethan in the car, his face a mask of conflicted emotions after our explosive argument. But I couldn't think about him now. Not when my mother needed me. Not when the weight of everything, Richard's betrayal, the public scandal, Ethan's hidden past, threatened to crush me. I had to be strong for her, the way she'd always been strong for me. I found her in a small, sterile room, her frail body dwarfed by the hospital bed, an oxygen mask covering her face. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound, a cruel reminder of how close I was to losing her. I sank into the chair, beside her, taking her hand in mine, her skin cool and paper-thin against my own. "Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking as tears welled in my eyes. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak smile, her fingers squeezing mine with a strength I didn't think she had left. "Maggie," she rasped, her voice muffled by the mask. "My brave girl." I couldn't hold back the sob that tore from my throat. Seeing her like this, so small, so vulnerable, brought back a flood of memories, each one a lifeline in the storm of my emotions. I remembered a Christmas morning when I was 7, the two of us in our tiny kitchen, flour dusting our aprons as we made gingerbread cookies. She'd laughed as I'd sneaked a piece of dough, her eyes bright with a joy that made the world feel safe. "We'll make these every year," she'd promised. And we had, even when money was tight and the holidays felt more like a burden than a celebration. That tradition had been our anchor, a reminder that love could endure anything. Now sitting here, I wished I could turn back time, to those simpler days when the only thing I had to fear was burning the cookies. I stood, needing to do something, anything, to feel useful. I found a basin and a cloth in the corner of the room, filled it with warm water, and gently began to wash her hair, the way she used to do for me when I was sick as a child. The act was simple, intimate, a quiet way to show her I was here, that I'd never leave her. "We'll get through this, Mom," I said, my voice steadier now, though the tears still fell. "I'll make sure you're okay. I promise." She closed her eyes, a soft sigh escaping her lips, and I felt a flicker of hope amidst the fear. She was still fighting, and so would I. I was drying her hair when the door opened, and I turned to see Ethan standing there, his presence as unexpected as a storm on a clear day. Beside him was a teenage girl, her dark hair and gray eyes a mirror of his own. Sophie. My breath caught in my throat as I realized who she was. The daughter he'd abandoned, the secret I'd uncovered in his study. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. But there was a quiet determination in her gaze that reminded me of Ethan. "I found her," Ethan said, his voice raw, stripped of the cold detachment I'd come to expect. "I've been looking for her for years, Margaret. I didn't know where Laura had taken her, but I never stopped trying." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine, pleading for understanding. "I don't deserve forgiveness. Not from her, not from you, but I want Sophie to know I never stopped loving her." I looked at Sophie, at the way she stood just a step behind Ethan, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. I thought of the letter I'd found, of Laura's anguished words, "You're never here," and I understood the depth of Ethan's failure. But I also saw the man standing before me now, a man who'd spent years searching for his daughter, who'd brought her here despite the chaos threatening to engulf him. He was trying to make things right, and that meant something. Sophie stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I just wanted to meet you," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "Dad told me about you, about why you married him. I think it's brave, what you're doing for your mom." Her words hit me like a wave, washing away some of the bitterness I'd been holding on to. I glanced at Ethan, seeing the vulnerability in his expression, and I realized that he wasn't the man I'd thought he was. Not entirely. He was flawed, deeply so, but he was trying to change. "I don't deserve forgiveness either," I said, my voice trembling as I looked at my mother. "I've been so caught up in this mess that I haven't been here for her the way I should." I turned to Ethan, my resolve hardening. "But I won't abandon her. I won't abandon my family no matter what happens." Ethan nodded, a flicker of something, respect, maybe even admiration, crossing his face. "I don't expect you to need me," he said, echoing my words from the car. "But I want to be here, for you, for Sophie, for your mother. I want to fix what I've broken." His words were a promise, one I wasn't sure I could trust. But in that moment, I wanted to believe him. I turned back to my mother, her breathing steadier now, and I felt a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I would fight for her, for Sophie, for the family we could become. And maybe, just maybe, I could fight for Ethan too. Not the man he'd been, but the man he was trying to be. The hospital had given us a fragile reprieve. My mother's condition stabilized after a tense night, her heart beating steadily under the watchful eye of the monitors. But the storm outside hadn't abated. The Boston Globe article, Richard Langston's betrayal, and the board's ultimatum still loomed over us, threatening to unravel everything Ethan had built and everything I was fighting for. I'd seen a new side of Ethan in the hospital, a man willing to face his past by bringing Sophie back into his life, but I wasn't sure if that was enough. Not yet. I needed to see him take a stand, to prove that he could be the man he claimed he wanted to be. Ethan had a plan, one he'd shared with me in the quiet hours of the morning as we sat by my mother's bedside. "I'm going to hold a press conference," he'd said, his voice steady, but laced with a vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "I need to set things right, for Sophie, for you, for myself." I'd nodded, unsure of what to expect, but willing to give him a chance to prove himself. Now, Standing in the same ancient church where we'd exchanged our vows, I watched as he prepared to face the world. The church was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. Its stained glass windows glowed with the soft light of late afternoon, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the wooden pews. Reporters filled the space, their cameras flashing. As Ethan stepped up to a makeshift podium, Sophie at his side, I stood a few steps behind, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, my heart a tangled mix of hope and fear. Ethan had chosen this place deliberately, a symbol of the beginning of our marriage, a place where he could rewrite the narrative that Richard had tried to destroy. "I've made mistakes," Ethan began, his voice clear and unwavering as he addressed the crowd. "I've spent years building Caldwell Industries, but in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters: family." He glanced at Sophie, his gray eyes softening with a tenderness I'd never seen before. 15 years ago, I failed my daughter, Sophie. I let my ambition blind me, and I lost her. I've spent every day since trying to find her, to make amends for the father I wasn't. Today, I'm here to say I'm sorry. To her, to her mother, and to everyone I've hurt along the way. The room was silent, the reporters hanging on his every word, their pens poised over notebooks. Sophie shifted beside him, her expression a mix of nervousness and resolve. Then, in a moment that took my breath away, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Ethan, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "I've been waiting for this for so long." The sight of them, father and daughter, reunited after years of pain, brought tears to my eyes. I saw the weight lift from Ethan's shoulders, the guilt he'd carried for so long easing in the warmth of her embrace. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, but for once I didn't care about the headlines. This wasn't about optics, it was about healing. Ethan turned back to the podium, his voice stronger now. "I've also failed my wife, Margaret," he said, his gaze finding mine. "Our marriage began as a contract, but it's become so much more. She's shown me what it means to fight for family, to put love above everything else. I won't let her down again." He paused, taking a deep breath. "To the board of Caldwell Industries, I say this. If you can't accept my marriage, if you can't accept the man I'm trying to be, then I'll step down as CEO. My family comes first." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the reporters scribbling furiously. I felt a surge of pride for Ethan, for the courage it took to lay himself bare like this. But before I could process the moment, a familiar figure stepped into the church. Richard Langston, his presence a dark stain on the fragile hope of the day. "Touching speech, Ethan," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he approached the podium. "But it won't save you. I've already spoken to the board. They're ready to vote you out, and I'll make sure the world knows you for the fraud you are." I stepped forward, my anger flaring as I placed myself between Richard and Ethan. "You can't destroy a man who's already found himself," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "You can take everything, his company, his reputation, but you can't take away this family. We're stronger than you'll ever be." Richard's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't respond. He turned and walked out, his threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The press conference ended, the reporters filing out with their stories of redemption and scandal. Ethan, Sophie, and I left the church together, the weight of the day settling over us. That evening, we went to a small diner on the edge of town, a quiet place where the world couldn't touch us. We sat in a booth, the three of us, and for the first time, I saw Ethan laugh, a real, unguarded laugh, as Sophie told a story about her school science project gone wrong. I watched them, my heart swelling with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. We were a family, not perfect, but real. As we ate, I thought of my mother, still in the hospital but fighting. and I knew I'd made the right choice. I'd fought for her, for Sophie, for Ethan. And in doing so, I'd found a strength I didn't know I had. The road ahead would be hard, but we'd face it together. And that was enough. The weeks following Ethan's press conference felt like a slow exhale after months of holding my breath. My mother's health had turned a corner. Her surgery was a success, and though her recovery would be long, the doctors were optimistic. I'd brought her back to Ethan's mansion, transforming a guest room into a space that felt like home for her, with her favorite quilt draped over the bed and a small vase of daisies on the nightstand. The mansion, once a cold and imposing place, was beginning to feel like a sanctuary, its walls now echoing with the sounds of laughter and love. Tonight, we'd gathered for a small family dinner, just the four of us. Me, Ethan, Sophie, and my mother. The dining room was softly lit, the table set with simple white dishes and a centerpiece of candles that flickered like stars. I'd spent the afternoon cooking with Sophie, the two of us giggling as we rolled out dough for homemade pizza, her teenage awkwardness melting away with every shared smile. Ethan had joined us later, his sleeves rolled up as he grated cheese, a playful smirk on his face when Sophie teased him about his lack of culinary skills. Watching them together, I felt a warmth in my chest, a quiet joy that I hadn't thought possible when I'd first walked down the aisle of that church. My mother sat at the head of the table, her wheelchair positioned carefully so she could see us all. She looked stronger than she had in months, her cheeks flushed with a hint of color, her eyes bright with pride as she watched us. "You've made me so proud, Maggie," she said, her voice soft but steady, reaching for my hand across the table. "You've always been my rock, but seeing you build this family, it's more than I ever could have hoped for." I squeezed her hand, my throat tight with emotion. "You taught me what family means, Mom," I replied, my voice trembling. "You showed me that love is worth fighting for no matter what." I glanced at Ethan, who was watching Sophie as she recounted a story about her new art class, her hands gesturing animatedly as she described a painting she'd started. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his gray eyes. And I saw the man he'd become, the man he'd fought to be. The board had accepted his press conference as proof of his commitment, allowing him to remain CEO. But Ethan had made it clear that his priorities had shifted. He'd delegated more responsibilities at work, carving out time for Sophie, for us. He was no longer the cold, distant man I'd married. He was a father, a partner, a man who'd learned the true meaning of honor. After dinner, Ethan and I slipped out to the garden, leaving Sophie and my mother to chat over a game of cards. The night was cool, the sky a deep velvet studded with stars, and the city lights of Boston glowed faintly in the distance. We stood side by side, our shoulders brushing, the silence between us comfortable for the first time. "Thank you, Margaret," Ethan said, his voice low and earnest, breaking the quiet. "For giving me a chance to make things right, for showing me what it means to fight for family." I turned to him, my heart swelling with a love I hadn't expected to feel. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice soft but steady, "for giving me a family I never thought I'd have." He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and we stood there, looking out at the city that had once felt so cold and unforgiving. Now, it was a backdrop to our new beginning, a canvas of lights that mirrored the hope in my heart. I thought back to the journey that had brought us here, the cold, transactional wedding, the nights of silence, the shattering revelations about Sophie, the public storm that had nearly broken us. I'd started this marriage as a woman bound by duty, my heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. I'd been afraid to hope, afraid to love, afraid that I'd lose myself in the process. But I hadn't lost myself. I'd found myself. Through my mother's unwavering love, through Sophie's quiet strength, through Ethan's redemption, I'd discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned that honor wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, about fighting for those you loved, even when the odds were against you. I looked at Ethan, at the man who'd once been a stranger, but was now my partner, my family. I thought of Sophie, of the way her laughter filled the house, of the sketches she'd started leaving on the kitchen counter, each one a testament to her healing. I thought of my mother, of the way her eyes lit up when she saw us together, her pride a balm to the wounds of the past. We weren't a perfect family. There were still scars, still challenges ahead, but we were real. And that was enough. As the night deepened, I leaned my head against Ethan's shoulder, the city lights shimmering below us. I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, a late-blooming happiness that had taken root in the cracks of our broken beginnings. I'd fought for this, for my mother, for Sophie, for Ethan, for myself, and I'd won. Not a victory of wealth or power, but one of love, of forgiveness, of family. And in that moment, under the stars, I knew I'd found my home. If you've been touched by this journey of love, redemption, and family, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It means the world to us. And if you want to join us for more heartfelt stories that inspire and uplift, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep building this community of hope together. See you in the next story.